but it's through consuming certain products that your spirituality is defined.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the SkyePod, brought to you by Holy Post Media. I am joined today by Paul Emery Putz. He is at Baylor University. You are the director of the Faith and Sports Institute at Baylor University's George W. Truett Theological Seminary. That's a long title. But for our purposes today, you are the author of The Spirit of the Game, American Christianity and Big Time Sports. What a great area to study. I think so many of us just assume that, of course, Christianity goes with sports, but you've written a whole book about how that wasn't always the case. So today we're going to look at that and get into the book and talk about, first of all, Paul, thanks for being here. My first question is, why did you write this book? Like, what about your background and interest led you to, I don't know how many years you spent studying the history of sports and Christianity, but what about your background led you to this topic?
Well, thanks for having me on. And I think it's autobiographical, like so many books are. I grew up in Nebraska in the Bible Belt. I was a pastor's kid, and in a very conservative home. We adapted over time, but early on we were so conservative that we didn't celebrate Christmas because Christmas was a pagan holiday. Mm-hmm. So it was the kind of that level. Didn't have a TV for a while. But the one area within this sort of guarded Christian home that I could engage in the world with was sports. And so I think early on I had that sense of connection with other people through sports. So I'm playing all the sports that I can. Basketball ends up being one I'm decent at. And so I played that throughout high school and for a small college. And then also through basketball, I got connected to a mentor, my high school basketball coach, who was part of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And I started to see my identity as a Christian, which is really important to me, being a pastor's kid, my identity as an athlete, which I felt a sense of affirmation for who I was when I'm on the basketball court. Those things were connected in some really important ways as I'm developing. So that's part of my story growing up. I move into secondary education after my college time. I'm going to be a high school teacher. I thought I'd be a coach. And in my mind, like, what do the coaches teach? They teach social studies so they can play videos, and then they can game plan while they pass out worksheets. That's a stereotype if any teachers are listening. I know that, but that was kind of the image I had. And so I get in the classroom, and as I'm teaching social studies, I'm also, I always liked history, but I got really drawn even more into history and wanting to ask these questions like, where did a group like the FCA come from? It shaped my own life. It shaped how I thought about what it means to be a Christian athlete, but I didn't have a sense of its history. Like, surely there were some people who came up with these ideas and developed it over time. So really my own curiosity about the origins of organizations led me to look for books that had been written about it. I didn't find much. I had questions that I wanted to ask that I didn't find answers for, and ended up coming to Baylor to do a PhD in history, where I got to explore those connections between sports and Christianity and eventually write a book about it.
I'm glad you did. So where my interest comes in this, I'm not an athlete. I didn't really grow up as an athlete. My dad's an immigrant, and for a lot of immigrants, sports is purely recreational. It's not a huge focus of their identity. So I didn't grow up in that environment like you did. But I studied history as an undergrad. I love history. I've had numerous guests on who've written history books. So the history of this is really interesting to me. And early in the book, you make an observation that is so obvious, but hadn't occurred to me. And I'm sure it's going to resonate with a lot of our listeners here. You make the observation that over the last century, so many parts of American culture have lost its Christian influence, or Christianity has less of a presence in so much of American culture. But in the last century, that's been the opposite with sports.
Yeah.
The Christian presence has only grown in sports, which makes it an outlier. And the obvious question is why? But I want to go back and start kind of where you do in the book with the 1920s. Talk about why that was such a pivotal decade for this relationship between not just sports and American culture, but sports Christianity in American culture. Why the 1920s? What happened that was so important?
Yeah. So I'll start by going back just a little bit further. And right before the 1920s, there's this movement scholars write about called Muscular Christianity. And if you do study sports and Christianity, that's kind of the area where scholars have helped us understand what was going on. So this is in the 19th century, the early 20th century. It's after the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution. And starting in the United Kingdom and also in the United States, you started to see Christians embrace sports in a way that they hadn't before. So before Muscular Christianity, there was a little bit of a dualism within Christianity where, sports were seen as a diversion from what really mattered. It could lead to sin. It could lead to breaking the Sabbath. So it was sort of maybe a necessary evil. It certainly wasn't a priority to do these bodily physical activities. But during the era of Muscular Christianity, there's a movement that really tries to emphasize this holistic view of the human being, mind, body, soul, intertwined. And it emphasizes the importance of physical activity in sports. The YMCA is the classic example of what emerges out of Muscular Christianity. And the YMCA has people like James Naismith, who actually creates basketball out of this Muscular Christian ideology. So before the 1920s, you had Christians who were making connections to sports, who were using sports to advance Christian ideas. Scholars have written about that. There's some good books about that. What I found when I was studying this was the 1920s are the era in American history where sports become a national obsession. Like, this is the era where, it's called the golden age of sports for a reason. You have $1 million boxing bouts. You have baseball, fans are crowding the stadiums. You have Babe Ruth and the Yankees touring the country, and fans are flocking to see these famous athletes. You have a national media ecosystem through the radio and through newspapers where you can actually have a national celebrity-based sports culture. And so in the 1920s, that's really when sports takes off as a national obsession, to the point that people call it a religion. At the same time, in the 1920s, you have this crisis for Protestants. So this other part of American culture and history that has defined itself as the established religion, or not fully established, but kind of informal established religion, is Protestantism. And they're figuring out, like, what do we do with ourselves? We have the modernist fundamentalists battling it out. We have this problem of youth culture, and there's jazz music, and there's flappers, and there's prohibition and people breaking prohibition. And so there's a feel for Protestants that they're losing their grip on the nation. Meanwhile, sports is ascending in influence, and yet scholars kind of skip over the 1920s as if Christians stopped caring about sports in that era. And that just wasn't a satisfying answer for me. I knew Christians had to have been involved with what was going on because everyone in America was doing stuff with sports. So I start there in the 1920s because I wanted to understand, in this changing modern consumer culture, how are Christians continuing to engage in sports culture, and what meaning are they making from it?
So it's interesting that there's a long history in America between the role of the church and the spread of Christianity and media, going all the way back to the colonial days and George Whitefield and his open air revivals. But this is an era where you have mass media for the first time. You have radio. Yeah. Newspapers are being able to transmit and communicate much more effectively because of the telegraph and things in the late 19th century, which allows sports to become more than a recreation. It becomes an industry. Yeah. And right on the heels of that, you find the church jumping on because of the things you just identified, this sense that the world is changing really quickly and we need something to help boost our perceptions. Explain the role of the YMCA, and I was especially intrigued by Amos Stagg.
Yeah,
what a great name, first of all, and the link between the church embracing, or at least Protestantism embracing athletics and sports, combined with this concern for masculinity. There's all kinds of echoes here of what I remember reading in Jesus and John Wayne from Kristen Kobes-Dumé. What is that link between the rise of sports culture in Christianity and the fear of losing masculinity in Christianity?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. One of the surprising things that I found that I didn't expect when I started this research, I started from the foundation of some of these sports ministries that are now fully evangelical. We're talking about a group like the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I mentioned them earlier. I'm sure we'll talk more about them. And they're not created till the 1950s. But when I looked at who the Fellowship of Christian Athletes were influenced by, like who were the Christian coaches and athletes who came before FCA, they were people like Amos Alonzo Stagg. And when I started to look at his story, I realized this guy is not an evangelical. This guy is not a fundamentalist. In fact, he intentionally chooses churches that are not fundamentalists. He goes to a church that's pastored by a close friend of Harry Emerson Fosdick, who's like the classic liberal Protestant preacher of the 1920s. And that just, I thought, okay, what's happening here? These are mainline Protestants in the 1920s who are primarily identifying with sports in terms of big time sports culture. And they're doing something there that doesn't fit what I was expecting, which is evangelicals using it as a platform.
Yeah, and Stagg, as you reported, he was an athlete at Yale and then became a football coach at the University of Chicago. Not exactly evangelical schools. So,
not at all. This is like, you are an insider.
Totally.
You are part of the elite.
Yeah.
You are kind of the guardian of, American leadership. And so it's that Protestant establishment, a masculinity associated with that. It's a masculinity centered on sort of a sense of respectability, a sense of authority, like you are already in a position of privilege and your job is to steward that and to maintain it. I mean, the classic figure of this type of masculinity is someone like Teddy Roosevelt, right? U.S. president, and he preaches this message of strength, but also you need some moral virtue along the way, So it's these dueling emphases for muscular Christians where they're feeling a sense that the Protestant church, especially the establishment mainline church, is losing its hold on young men. And to reach young men, you need to offer them something that is quote unquote heroic, that is adventurous, where they're exerting themselves, a more aggressive Christianity. And so that's very much a part of where football comes into play, where someone like Amos Alonzo Stagg fits. But at the same time, and this sometimes gets lost, I think, in the versions of militant masculinity that Kristen Dumé writes about, and her book is excellent. Some of those versions, they sort of drop off the other part, which is emphasized by these earlier muscular Christians, which is moral restraint, which is sacrifice for the good of others, which is a sense of service to society. And that's very much what Teddy Roosevelt and Amos Alonzo Stagg emphasized too, that it's, yes, you're drawn into this courageous cause, but it's supposed to be something that engenders loyalty, sacrifice, discipline, and even a softening in a certain sense of the harsh, super masculine traits. So that's what Amos Alonzo Stagg is trying to do. A gentleman, a respectable man who can go on the football field and take his tackle hard, but also does it fairly, plays by the rules, and develops those traits of moral virtue along the way.
So when I think of Teddy Roosevelt, for example, and his form of masculinity, he was celebrated because he was an adventurer. He went out west and kind of did the cowboy thing. He was a soldier. So a lot of times in American popular culture, we use imagery of the rugged individualist in the Western frontier or the soldier as models of masculinity. Why did football or sports in general come into the picture? Was it because there weren't as many opportunities for soldiering and cowboying out there, and we needed something that young men could actually do, and sports filled that need? Is that why that arose at that moment?
I do think there's something to that. And other scholars have made this point. Like it's in the 1890s where there's this famous essay about the closing of the frontier by Frederick Jackson Turner, a historian. that's the decade when football really becomes a prominent part of college life. And football, you mentioned Stagg is a Yale graduate. Football is connected to the Ivy Leagues. That's where it gets its start. It's these privileged institutions where you have young men who are from well-to-do families, and maybe they don't have an opportunity. They don't have a war to fight. They aren't going out and conquering, really taking over Native American territory. And so the question is, how can you develop in those young men this sense of courage and adventure? And football absolutely is connected to that. It's something that they write about. Someone like Stagg writes about how football can prepare men for the battle of life. And it is geared towards elite men at first. The idea is that we need the well-to-do middle and upper class white men to play football, because these racialized notions of the so-called uncivilized races, they're more physical, they're more they exercise more, their bodies are in better shape. We need to make sure that the upper and middle class white men are also developing their bodies. So along with those ideas of the well-to-do, respectable manhood we've been talking about, there's racist notions of who is the right type of man to lead that play into football's popularity spreading at these elite institutions.
Yeah, and this is the same era as eugenics, where there's so much focus on racial differences and perfecting a race or a humanity through sterilization and breeding, all that sort of stuff. And it's interesting, football, at least in my view, is the most militant of popular sports. I mean, it has the most military-like tactics, where you have two lines facing off each other, just like old school warfare. You're trying to take territory from the other side. So it is interesting that it fills this proxy role of war that a lot of elite men at Ivy League schools weren't participating in, but this gave them a way of participating in it and gaining what they see as the virtues from it. Before we leave the 1920s, have you made any connections between 100 years ago and what you're seeing today? Because there's a lot in the news right now about young men returning to Christianity, the need for this more masculine, tougher, more militant form of faith, that some Christian nationalism is very appealing. You have voices out there like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan and others who are flirting with all kinds of Christianity. There's reports that young men are being drawn towards Calvinism and Eastern Orthodoxy and these other forms of faith that seem more rigid or definitive. Are we in yet another cycle of people fearing Christianity has become too feminized and men are too weak, and we need to kind of have this muscular, masculine Christianity again? Is it a repeat of 100 years ago, or is this something different we're seeing today?
I think there's resonances. There's definitely resonances, but there's also some key differences. I mentioned before, who is driving this muscular Christian movement? It's liberal Protestants. It's mainline Protestants.
Right. That's not true today.
I mean, the classic, one of the classic examples of like the height of muscular Christianity in its progressive era form is this called the Men in Religion Forward movement. And in 1911 and 1912, like the whole point of this movement is to go out and make your cities better. So it's a government reform, social services, social gospel. Social gospel is very tied into muscular Christianity. So yes, there's, I think people today sometimes have a hard time, people expect like the bundles to all be like, if there's the liberal bundle and you are a liberal, then everything must be good. If you're conservative, right? You have a hard time kind of separating out like, hey, there's these people in the progressive era who were social gospel, progressive Christians, and also racist with these ideas of white Anglo-Saxon superiority. And at the same time going out and caring for poor people and saying, we need a Christianity that is going to reach the downtrodden. And that's very much what's happening with a lot of these muscular Christian ideas. They're using racialized notions of the quote unquote white man's burden to then encourage the quote unquote best of society to go out and help out those who might need help. So that service-oriented perspective, the connection to liberal Protestantism makes it different. There's also elements by the 1920s, what happens with muscular Christianity is it shifts a bit from this idea of social reform And it really gets connected more to the business world. I think of the classic example is Bruce Barton, who is this ad executive at a time when marketing and advertising really first becomes an industry in America. Bruce Barton is the preacher's son, and he's a leader in this field, but he writes a best-selling biography of Jesus called The Man Nobody Knows, publishes it in 1925. And it really presents Jesus in liberal Protestant ways, but in very human ways, as this boisterous businessman figure who can slap you on the back, and he can go out and he could cheer for the football team. And at the same time, he's like a business executive who takes 12 disciples and turns it into the best Christianity, the best organization the world has ever known. So there's a shift from the prototype muscular Christian to almost, this business friendly world in the 1920s that I think is really important to understanding what happens even in sports, because as sports becomes commercialized, as sports becomes focused again on big business in the 1920s, the man that is trying to produce is a man fit for business leadership, instead of that earlier version like a Teddy Roosevelt, which is a man fit for political leadership or service or the military and that sort of thing.
Let's talk about, you mentioned how football really took off in the Ivy League circles, and Stagg was a Yale guy and all that, but it was also the 1920s that football starts to take root in the South. And ask anybody today, nobody associates football with the Ivy League. Right?
That's right.
But football is like a religion in the American South. Explain why football found such receptivity in the South at this time, and how it linked to the lost cause. This is, roughly a generation after the Civil War. What about the South was ripe to receive football and sports and integrate it into their culture?
Yeah, it's one of the things I tried to do with this book. I wanted to recognize the complexity of different Protestant cultures and trying to draw on these threads, because sometimes we lump them all together. And so I write about mainline Protestants, sort of the establishment, who are mostly Northern and Midwestern based. I write about, Black Protestants and the Black church. I'm writing about the fundamentals who become neo-evangelicals. But then also, it was clear to me that there's something different about Southern Protestants, white Southern Protestants, and we need to recognize that difference. And so sports is a good way to get at that, because in the 1920s, for many white Southern Protestants, there's a desire to become more a part of the national mainstream, but they're not yet. And football becomes this way to assert an identity, to claim a place in a modern America, but still have a sense of regional identity that gets linked to this story they're telling themselves about the past. So, with the Lost Cause, you think about this is around the time when this movie called Birth of a Nation comes out in 1915, which really popularizes at a national level the idea that the white South were victims of what happened after the Civil War, that their quote unquote way of life is destroyed. And for a brief time, they were taken over by African Americans who were now voting. And so they're presented as the victims, the oppressed people. And Birth of a Nation gives momentum to that idea. And so football becomes a way for these Southern schools to have their young men go out on the field and play out, kind of recreate, the old Civil War ideas, these battles of guarding your home and protecting your home and asserting a way of life that's tied to segregation. And it's also in the 1920s where you start to see intersectional games that are played by college football teams across the country. So you'll have Southern teams might play a Northern team, or they might go and play a team on the West Coast. And so when Alabama goes and they play Stanford, or they play California, it becomes like a metaphor for the South versus the North.
Right.
Or,
you talk about the
Center
game
College in Yale or Harvard.
Right. You talk about the Center College rivalry with Harvard, and it is like a proxy, again, a military analogy for the Confederacy versus the Union. It's the South versus the North, and we're not fighting with guns anymore on a battlefield. We're going to fight with footballs on the field. So, but there's such a shame honor culture in the South, yes. And that gets linked here with our ability to defeat our enemies on the football field is the way we regain our honor that was stolen from us in the Civil War, the lost
or even to
cause.
lose valiantly, right? I mean, Centre
Yes.
College does lose their first game to Harvard, but they lose in a close match. It's like 6-0, and it would have been a huge upset. And so that is even framed as recreating the Civil War, where the South lost, the quote unquote good guys lost if you're the white South, but at least you held your honor while you do it. Once they start winning games, that shifts, right? And it becomes a way to reclaim that identity. I mean, you think about Confederate flags eventually being flown during Southern football games, and the songs that are played, and there very much is a culture of recreating a story that white Southerners tell themselves through college football. That really gets going in the 1920s, and before then, as you mentioned, college football was seen as a Yankee game. It was seen as something from the Northerners, so we have to resist it. By the 1920s, they kind of claim it, and over time begin to shape the national culture of football along the way.
Okay, let's jump ahead to after World War II in the Cold War era. We've talked a lot over the years on this show and other Holy Post media shows about the impact that the Cold War has had on American evangelicalism. But your book focuses on the way the Cold War impacted the Christian fascination with sports. And this is also the era where FCA is created, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Talk a little bit about how communism, or the fear of communism in the Cold War, impacted Christianity in sports, and how you see this shift from the mainline Protestant sort of elite roots of this relationship between sports and Christianity, and how it morphs over to what we think of today as primarily an evangelical or fundamentalist fascination with sports.
Yeah. So, if we think about what do we mean when we think of mainline Protestants, the image tends to be the intellectual, it tends to be the bureaucrat, tends to be the professor, and the liberal, and those might be the most prominent representatives. But the fact is, if you look at people in the pews, even today, like the numbers and the data show that white mainline Protestants are far more conservative on social issues than the stereotype might be. And so when I was looking into this, when we look at sports, who are the mainline Protestants drawn to sports? A lot of times they're mainline. They're not necessarily, like, theology isn't the main thing that defines them. They're sort of liberal, but also not like going all the way there. And what they're really concerned about is just everyday life. Like, how does religion affect their everyday life? And I wanted to have a category, a kind of a way of differentiating, like, what type of mainline Protestant are we talking about? There's a couple scholars, especially Matt Hedstrom, who's written extensively on liberal Protestants, and he has written about what he calls the Middlebrow religion. And so I took his concept to describe this group of mainline Protestants I called the Middlebrow Protestants, who, yes, they're part of the mainline. They're not fundamentalists. They're not like focusing on winning people to Christ, but they're focusing on building Christian character. They're focusing on love of God, love of country. They see themselves as generally tolerant. So they're sort of open-minded and optimistic, but then also rooted in some like default assumptions of white normativity they're shaping their view of the world. Those middlebrow mainliners are the ones who really engage in sports in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And it's out of those roots that the Fellowship of Christian Athletes comes along. The Cold War is the thing that kind of brings these pieces together, because with the Cold War, we have this national threat. We have this fear of the Soviet Union, who is trying to win not only the rest of the world, but they're trying to win American children and young people, supposedly, to this communist way of life. And so there's a movement within the United States to resist that. We have to fight back against communism. And one way to do that is by capitalizing on...
Don't worry, this is not the end of the episode. There's actually plenty more. But to listen to the rest, you need to be a Holy Post Plus subscriber. So head over to holypost.com/SkyePod and sign up for just $5 a month. Not only will you get uninterrupted episodes of the SkyePod, which means you'll never have to hear this dumb announcement again, but you'll also get access to everything else at Holy Post Plus, including episodes of Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess, bonus interviews, live streams, the Holy Post Book Club, exclusive merchandise, and a whole bunch more. And you'll get the warm, fuzzy feeling of knowing that you're supporting our work of creating smart, pro-neighbor Christian content. So head over to holypost.com/SkyePod and subscribe today.